It's a very great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Sir John Sulston, who I hope I can call John from now on.
Please do.
John, where and when were you born?
I was born in Fulmer, Bucks, which always sounds very strange. It was in the war, 1942. Strange simply in the sense that nobody's ever heard of Fulmer. So anyway, we were...
It's March 1942.
March 1942, that's correct, yes.
Yep.
And so I was a war baby, and I remember little of those years, apart from little recollections of hiding under the table when the sirens went. But we were not in a seriously bombed area. We lived at Chesham Boyce with my grandmother during the war. My father was a priest, an Anglican priest, and was
nearly a Freudian slip there. Roman Catholic, an Anglican priest.
An Anglican priest. And so he was away, largely in Africa, I think, and my mother, who was a teacher before, was looking after me with my grandmother. Very trying years for my parents, I'm sure, from all sorts of points of view, as you can imagine.
Tell me something about their characters, because presumably your father came back and then you got to know him better.
That's right. Well, my father I have a very particular relationship with, in the sense that I've diverged totally from him. I was brought up by him as an Anglican and brought into the church, and I was a server in the church. I really tried hard to be a believer and did all those things for quite a long time until I was a teenager. And of course that was an important part of our relationship. He was anxious to pass on to me his own philosophy and wisdom. He was also certainly anxious that I would make my way in the world. He's an academic. He might well have become an academic actually himself, but chose to go into the church. And he certainly expected me to do my best and to do well, and they were very pleased when I was successful at school and that thing. But our relationship, as I now look back through time, it's quite some time ago that he died, 1986 actually, it's completely coloured by the later part, where I had to break away from him, because during my teenage years I became to regard myself very definitely as agnostic, and before long really atheist. In the Cambridge way, in the rationalist, humanist atheism is where I've ended up, and it was simply completely at odds with him, and he found it very distressing that I took this course. I remember here, for example, just one remark. He said, in terms of morality and what one ought to do, he said, you will insist on making your own morals. And there was nothing wrong with my morals, but they were not following the church's morals in the same way. So it's one other point about him, one other anecdote, if you like. When I came up to Cambridge, I remember discussing religion, along with everything else, as one does with fellow students all night. And I found that very few students understood how important it was to me whether or not to be religious, to believe in God, if you like, as straightforwardly as that. Most students said, well, why is that important? I said, it's the only thing that matters. You have to decide about this. It's because of my inexperience. And it's a lesson there, how one's own experience colours one's priorities, what you think is important in life.
There are two questions that come out of that. One is, what kind of Anglican was he? Was he it sounds as a missionary, that he was evangelical.
No, he was not. He was a middle, not high, middle to high perhaps, Anglican. His role was at weekends as a parish priest. He was an assistant priest in the local parish, but during the week he simply worked in London. He was one of the secretaries of the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, which later merged with the Church Missionary Society. He had little experience himself of missionary work, although he did go on tours occasionally and visit the stations, the mission stations that they ran.
We got on to religion very early. We usually get on to it just a little later, but let's explore it a bit further. Perhaps with a contemporary relevance, or reference, as you know, there's a big story going around in the media just yesterday and today about the Royal Society and the teaching of creationism in schools. And there are those, like Richard Dawkins, who argue that, in effect, that fellows of the Royal Society should not be members of churches. That is the extension of his argument. What is your feeling around this theme?
I'm not sure that's an accurate quotation of Richard. I think Richard is saying that the officers, and particularly the education officer of the Royal Society, should not be a clergyman. With the last point, I agree. I think it was an ill-advised appointment to Michael Rice. He's an interesting man, a complex man, but I don't think that he is appropriate for the head of education in the Royal Society. That's my view.
So, the Reverend Polkinghorne, for instance, should not be, should never have been or never be an officer. Is that the case?
Well, other sorts of officer, I know, I think I would restrict the point to education, actually. And of course, actually, it's not strictly an officer even. It's he's in the office. He's one of the administrators. It's simply that it is such a very particular position in this age, especially given the situation in America, which is spreading here, although perhaps that makes us well, for whatever reason, a belief in creationism, or yes, a belief really in creationism is rising in this country, it's increasing gradually, and how we deal with that is unclear. And I think Michael Rice is quite sincerely trying to damp it. He's talking about the way children should be educated, but my reading of what's going on in America and the way the intelligent design people behave is that actually you have to make your position rather clearer than he is doing. He's talking about, well, there's a legitimate worldview, there's a legitimate way of talking about evolution, it's just different, and we must not try and persuade these people into the idea that what they're saying is wrong and what we're saying is right. I actually saw the one counter which I thought was very apposite. I immediately thought, for example, my first one was that say, well, if somebody at the back of the class says 2 and 2 make 5 in a mathematics lesson, you have to say, no, they don't, they make 4, I'm sorry. And it's not a matter of worldview. Now that, of course, maybe seem a little, digital, very clear, but nevertheless, there probably are people, sects indeed, in the world who believe 2 and 2 make 5. Closer to home and more realistically, and I actually got this off the off a blogger somewhere. He said, or she said, look, we don't actually give a lot of credence to astrology in astronomy lessons, nor do we give a lot of credence to homeopathy in chemistry lessons, because we have very good reasons in both cases for considering that these are false beliefs. I think the fairy stories that the religions, all the religions, but especially creationism because it's intense, wrap around the fact of evolution are wrong. They're not a worldview. And therefore I oppose Michael's position on this and don't think that he should be saying these things, given that he has this label, Director of Education of the Royal Society. If he were a fellow, and as you saw I hesitated about officers, indeed, yes, if he were, but particularly if he's a fellow it would be alright. If you're an officer then I think you should be equally careful, because the trouble is you come with this title. Okay? Martin Rees is a very spiritual man, but you don't find him speaking in this fashion. He, of course, has the very difficult job of balancing his various factions over this issue.
Well, Martin I've interviewed, and he's talked about this on film. I noticed in Robin McKee's piece on this in The Observer, he said he made a kind of half-snide remark about Martin. He said he described himself as an unbelieving Anglican.
That's right, he does believe. He does say that, yeah.
And it sort of implied that that was an untenable position. He goes to Trinity Chapel and so on, and that the President of the Royal Society should not do this. There was an implication in McKee's.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that?
No, I think it depending what he says to people, it's fine, and particularly because he's Anglican, it's fine. If you see what I mean. To be an unbelieving Anglican is actually quite resonates to me. I spent my teenage in that form, and it's a matter of respecting the institution whilst not accepting all its tenets, I would say. And by the by, it's a great tragedy, I think, for this country that Anglicanism is declining and various evangelical sects are becoming more powerful. The thing is, Anglicanism is one of the great secular religions. Always has been ever since the Reformation, I guess. That you're more expert in that than I. And so I think there is something truthful about that. Personally, I would find it difficult. I would not act as spiritual as Martin does in his statements, because I would find this conflicting. But Tim Hunt, actually, in the various comments that have been made about this, I think came up with a remark which I've made to people myself, that whilst in biology we are dealing very much with facts, with very clear facts, which is remarkable when you think about it. This has only happened in the last 50 years, really. We're dealing with very cosmologists are in the phrase of that wonderful climbing book, Touching the Void, and it drives some of them a little mad and it makes others a little spiritual. They are touching things that are way beyond our comprehension, much more than biology, and so you can understand these different attitudes between these different groups of people. But nevertheless, Michael Rice, I do find exceptional in the Royal Society in going beyond policy with his label on, and the label is always there. It's interesting we're having this conversation, and I'm happy to have it, because I just refuse to have it with all the newspapers. I'm one of the few who've been asked, who've not spoken. Mark Henderson of the Times asked me to speak yesterday, and I said, this is an internal matter. And this, I think, is a great shame that the Royal Society is trying to resolve this through the pages of the newspapers, and I rather deplore those who are doing it, actually.
Could I noticed the Tim Hunt distinction. I think probably physicists, some of the physicists I've talked to fall on the side of the cosmologists because they feel it's so mysterious, and
Yes.
Einstein is a very, very famous example of this.
Yes.
The wonder of the universe, which makes your categorical atheism rather than agnosticism, as you described yourself. Is that your position still?
It's my position for my lifetime. And I've also come very strongly to label myself as a humanist. The point about humanism, I'm starting with that one first because it's important, is that humanism does provide the necessary framework to live one's life honestly, morally and joyfully. If you have nothing, and many religious people have said to me, they say, I don't know how you can be an unbeliever because you must have no comfort. I have this huge comfort, and it's a humanist comfort, which is that I have a finite existence. I have very good reasons for acting in a moral fashion. And I have very good reasons for feeling that my life is worthwhile because there are going to be other lives after it. And of course, being some kind of published scientist or academic of any kind as we are, it actually makes it much easier than if one doesn't see anything coming out of one's life. But in fact, everybody has something coming out of their life. Okay, so that's the sort of the framework, as I say, into which I fit now. Why atheism rather than agnosticism? This is, as I see it at the moment, I see that we have enormous amounts to discover as a strategy for going forward as human beings. I believe atheism makes coherent sense. All the religions are in conflict with one another. They have different stories. They have stories which are based on insubstantial records. They all justify their stories, of course, by saying that there was some direct communication from a deity or other entity in the past that has led them to this line of belief. But I find those unconvincing, and particularly I find them unconvincing because of the conflict. This was my main argument when I was discussing it with my father, that I couldn't, and he found it obviously hard to answer that. It's one of the most difficult questions for believers to answer. And so I see, as I was saying in Switzerland a couple of days ago to a meeting, I gave a keynote speech, and I was talking about the good that science can bring, and lots of detail about the way we organise the economics of the world, which I was really talking about, which at the end, I come back, as I always do, to the extraordinary advance and enlightenment that's occurred, enlightenment the small e, that's occurred as a result of our discovery process. And it's actually been going on for a very long time, but when you look, the recent landmarks that we all use, I mean, you have the cosmological revolution, you have the Darwinian revolution, you have the discoveries of fundamental physics, which completely changed the worldview of humanity. Well, I look at that story and I say, this is the way we should be going forward. These are the exciting things that have happened to humanity in the last few hundred years. The science has had to fight established religion of all kinds in order to get them accepted and tolerated, and we're still fighting the Darwinian one, as we were saying a few minutes ago. Consequently, I think that atheism is a terrific strategy, both for me personally and for humanity.
Thank you. There are further things. One is that I understand that you're going to run a centre at Manchester, which is on, part of it is to do with ethics and science and the relationship between the two. Do you think all this discussion we've been having is going to feed a lot into how you run that?
Well, I'm not personally running it. I'm in a rather odd position. I'm called the chair of it. And the reason for that is that Manchester have a strategy of recruiting existing Nobel Prize winners part-time, frankly, to bolster their position in the RAE and academically. And this is not entirely, cynical. I mean, it's fine if you can get interesting people coming in. Now, my particular little sphere involves the full-time director, John Harris, who is a bioethicist. He holds views on the enhancement of humanity, which I partly accept and partly argue with him, which is great fun. And he is interested in all sorts of social aspects of his bioethics. So this is a good partnership, I think. We've got the opportunity to expand it. Got a bit of grant money from the university. We're looking for grant money from other people, and we see how much we can build. He's got an existing running group of philosophers and lawyers who what I want to do is to expand into social and policy areas. Now, as an example of why it's a good place to spend part of my time, I have a counterpart there in economics, namely Joseph Stiglitz, who you may know, a very interesting man, I think. One of our best economists, in the sense that he's actually driving down the way I think should go, which is, turning one's back on the Chicago school and really saying this should be for mankind, a humanist economist, if you like. And so we, I think, have a great opportunity to do things together. He has a counterpart called the Brooks World Poverty Institute. So I'm really looking forward to these collaborations, and I see it as a platform by which, even in my part-time position, I can have some bearing on research and maybe influence in policy matters, which I think are important.
Such a fascinating conversation. I really want to go on with it. Just one last question. It strikes me that one of the difficulties in coming back to the Darwinian problem is that science nowadays teaches us that we don't know things for certain, that there is an uncertainty principle, and that all we know is provisional and not proven. In other words, everything is a theory rather than a fact. And when Dawkins talks about, the facts prove, he's actually going beyond what historians and philosophers of science would say about things. Until it's all we know is that things are as they are, and then they haven't yet been disproved. Now, to get that message across to the general public is extremely difficult, because as soon as you start talking about Darwinianism is just a theory, and we can't actually be certain it's absolutely right and so on, people get very confused. I wondered how one could get over that dilemma.
I think it is difficult, and I think Richard is doing it deliberately, because he has observed that the intelligent design crowd have seized on the theory of evolution as indicating that it's very uncertain, and indeed that this was a creationist line before. The fact of the matter is, of course, that creationism, and all religious doctrines, are also theories, and yet they are alleged to be facts. So this is purely terminology as I see it. If we find that people are treating our theories, which actually are extremely substantial and more or less amount to facts in a few cases, whilst calling their very flimsy theories facts, then we have to adjust the terminology somehow. Now, I haven't thought through clearly how to do it. I don't regard myself as much of an educator at the moment, but I ought to be thinking more about these things and trying to make my own line on it. But that's as far as I can tell you at the moment that I've got. I
remembered one other question. The one religion I've always found as an alternative to Christianity, because I went through the same features as you did in my teens, is not really a religion at all, and that's Buddhism.
Oh, yes.
And I wondered whether you'd ever been attracted to any other philosophical system like that.
I did a tiny bit of reading as a student around these various other religions, and absolutely I did find a certain attraction there. In the end, I find it insubstantial compared with the extraordinary series of discoveries we've made by rational and scientific approaches. And so, you know, I haven't continued with interest, but, you know, I could come back to it. But for the moment, as I emphasise, my atheism is provisional anyway, and I don't see the comfort and inspiration of atheism in the humanist version running out before the end of my lifetime. I don't need anything else, and I don't argue strongly with people, but if the subject comes up, I will try and explain to them my point of view in a tiny, slightly evangelical way. I mean, well, actually, to be honest, no, not. I mean, people, you know, if people need comfort, then you look to how you can give them comfort. The only sense in which I'd be evangelical, and strongly so, of course, is the responsibility to conduct rational policies that do not endanger the future of humanity, because in my book, on this provisional atheist outlook, that is all we've got. In fact, let me expand on that, because I think it's important. Despite speculations, which of course we all love to do over high table and so forth, on the probability of other life forms elsewhere in the universe, we have no shred of evidence that any exist, and certainly we have no shred of evidence that any intelligent life lives anywhere else. We simply do not know at all the probabilities or improbabilities that have brought us to this point. And I think, therefore, we should treat ourselves collectively, as far as we possibly can, as very precious. So this would be a very strong evangelical argument on my part. So you do not know what else is out there. You do not know whether your God or your faith or whatever has any substance. What you do know is that we exist here and now. Let's make sure we don't destroy ourselves. So in that sense, I'm extremely opposed to those evangelical philosophers or policies which are attributed, of course, for example, to the Bush administration, that use to some degree, although I think economics is the greater power, but certainly use religion as some sort of cloak for what are extremely aggressive and dangerous practices in world policy.
Thank you. Well, we may come back to it later, but
Yeah.
let's go back to your childhood. You talked quite a lot about, or a bit about your father. What about your mother?
Good. We should certainly talk about my mother, because I had the relationship with her, which I think is common and tremendously important to a growing child, in that she, rather than my father, was my confidant and my rock. My father he's not a Victorian father in the sense of being totally removed or beating me or anything like that, not at all. But it was just that it was my mother who I could come home from school or you know, other expedition, find and weep or exult or whatever is necessary when you come home. And she would say not a lot, she would listen, she would draw me out, she would, you know, do what was necessary to help me over the next step. And as a teacher, I guess she practiced for a long time doing this, mostly with girls. It was all segregated then. She taught at Watford Grammar School for a long time. She was teacher of English, by the way. But of course teaching is teaching, and she was good at it. And that was my relationship really with her. And one very surprising thing, again, I'm sorry to one more anecdote on the religious front, because it's so important. It's so important to me, this religious thing. You see, throughout the time when I was sort of losing it with my father, as it were, in terms of religion, my mother was always the neutral party. Although she clearly was a believer and clearly very strongly supported my father, she never indicated to me that she felt I was going off the rails, as he did. She was somehow the go-between. Again, very typical description of mother, I think, very often. And the most extraordinary event happened after she died, which was later than my father, is among her possessions was a letter to me, saying how sad she was that I'd lost my faith and she hoped that I would one day regain it. And it came as a shock was a bereavement.
Was it a letter addressed to you after she died?
Exactly.
Or?
Sorry, it was left
Yeah.
for me to read
I
after
see.
she died.
Mm.
And it was like a second bereavement, because here was this person that I'd thought of really as being somehow the unbelieving Anglican, if you like, and yet somehow, I disappointed her. For her, I was somehow going on the wrong rails. It's so remarkable, the woman bridging between the two males. Interesting story, I think.
Were there any other people to be bridged, in other words, brothers and sisters?
I have one sister who is 4 years younger than me, and so never had a strong relationship. But we had a very happy relationship. But I was always, as she describes now, and we see each other quite regularly, of course. And she, always says, "Oh well," she was always following along somehow. But she had fairly similar times, I think, with our parents. The expectations of the father, the relationship with the mother stronger, and actually one thing that we laugh rather bitterly about now is that I, as the boy, was sent to fee-paying private schools, and she went to the state school. In fact, I didn't take a large chunk of the family income because I did well enough to get scholarships throughout. So but we find it quite dismaying now. As to, it does my Daphne. It's ridiculous that people should be treated differently.
Same with me. Let's come to that. Can you remember your first school?
Yes, I went first to a preparatory school, which was just a couple of blocks away from the house.
Fee paying?
Oh yes. At that time, I guess they probably were paying the fees. I'm not sure if I got any sort of.
What was it called?
York House.
And that's in.
This is
Fulham.
the town where we lived. Oh yes, I described where I was born, the early life. When my father came back in 1945, they bought a house in a sort of corner of a place called Rickmansworth, which is one of the way stations on the M25 these days.
Hertfordshire.
That's right, and it's very much Betjeman land. I grew up in Betjeman land. I loved his poetry for this reason. It described so exactly the goings on around us. And this is an edge of Rickmansworth called Mill End, and there happened to be this little prep school, not very good, not very good. I mean, it's the sort of place where you succeed on your own, but you're given, because the teachers are. They're very characterful. They're very strong people in a way, but not particularly bright. And one was a retired military man, and so on and so forth. And between them, they sort of you pull through.
There was no particular teacher who influenced you at that stage.
Really not, I would say. I remember incidents and so forth which were more or less amusing, but possibly immodestly. I don't recall getting much out of any of them. I strongly suspect my mother was my most important educator throughout those years, quite honestly. I mean, being a teacher has so often, we were taught to read long before I went to school, and so I was always sort of ahead of the game. I suppose I was a slightly precocious individual, and that I know I was always young for my year. I got sort of bumped up. But how much of that was me and how much was because I don't have a fantastically high IQ or anything like that. But I was quite diligent, hard-working, which probably helped. But mostly it was because I'd had so much pre-schooling, really. Of course, nowadays people are competing more and more to do this. It's quite appalling, the pre-schooling pressure, and even the idea of... I remember, when did that come out? Well, that's right, I remember arguing about on the Richard and Judy show of all places. There was this idea that you sign to your children before they can speak, and thereby get them going earlier. Actually, you must have opinions about that.
Well, the Japanese do this in the womb. I mean,
do they?
Oh yes, you start playing them educational music anyway in the womb to get them started.
Ahead of the signing.
Yeah. Oh yes, before that.
But what do you think about the signing? Because I mean, the thing is, every parent communicates with its child by body language anyway, before it can speak. So what is this signing business, sort of formalising it? But there's somebody on the East Coast who teaches it, and she was on the Richard and Judy show, and it's awful. It's driving people on, you must be ahead of the game.
Yes. Well, they do go in for that in a big way in the Far East, particularly Japan, but also China and elsewhere, so it wouldn't surprise me if they've signed up, so to speak, to that.
Really competitive.
Was there anything, were you beginning to develop hobbies. Quite a lot of biologists and others start sort of watching animals or snails or things in there, even in, when they're 9 or 10. Were you doing any of that?
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, long before 9 or 10.
Hmm.
Not especially biology. Or I was like one of the Enlightenment people, I suppose. I was a natural philosopher. No, well, I was with my hands. Basically, I'm a fingers person, and I just loved anything. I was always taking things to pieces from the time I could, playing with the electricity. I loved electricity because it did remarkable things, rather unexpected things, especially if you start digging into the mains and so forth. And my parents had no idea what was going on half the time, and I had, other boys would come and mess around with me. My sister was very interested, and we could experiment it on if we allowed. She was pretty canny with electricity, I mean. But I also had an aquarium. Yes, of course, I dipped into the pond. As an uncle gave me a little microscope. I had a chemistry set and tried to make explosions. I was interested in balloons and wires and cranes and Meccano and everything. Anything.
From what age were you doing all those
Well, as I
things?
say, absolutely from the earliest age. I mean, I don't think it was a continuous process from sort of crawling and playing with things to just being much more manipulative, probably, than average, which is very typical, of course, of the practicing scientist. To be, we're suggesting that one might show a bent to biology or something, and some do, but I think very common for people who end up as practical bench scientists is just this finger manipulation, just exploring the world in a way which is not just abstract or visual.
Although, I have noticed this in a lot of the scientists, but some of them also lament, like Richard Friend and others, how the way in the last 10, 15 years, that sort of sealing wax and string Cavendish tradition of fiddling with things has largely disappeared. Everyone just sits in front of computer screens, and there is a movement, I gather, I was reading something the other day, to bring this back and to make science again a hands-on thing. But
in schools, you mean?
Well, no, as scientists. I mean,
scientists.
people in labs are being given Rubik cubes and
see.
Meccano sets to try and bring back this idea that they manipulate the world and make gadgets for themselves instead of buying them. But have you noticed this big trend in your own life of this movement of science away from something where you could use your body?
Well, I've always been hands-on throughout, and the sorts of things I was doing, I suppose the least manipulative stage, in a sense, was when I was doing the cell lineage of Caenorhabditis. Now, however, simply handling the worms, there were a lot of little gimmicks and tricks, and that's why I was successful. That's why I got awards for somehow doing things that at the time other people couldn't. And a lot of it did have to do with pouring layers of agar and one thing or another. Just so there was a sort of fine scale, mini scale, micro scale really manipulation. And then after that was over, I came back to biochemistry and started working on genomes. And I was just manipulating throughout, and so until I sort of finally stepped away from the bench around 2003, I think it was, when we finished the nematode genome finally, every last little bit. I was running between my bench. I was doing all the work with DNA, there were assistants, but there were a number of key things that I did. I behaved a little bit like John Gurdon, who I understand continued to forever to do the injections himself, and I did rather the same thing with DNA cloning. I thought that I really had to do this myself, and then other people would help with some of the other stuff. So I was doing that, and I was full-time director of the Sanger Centre, Kingston, and full-time doing the worm cloning. I really was, running 2 jobs and working that hard. Every weekend I would be in there 2 days, and this was bench staff, fingers. So no, I had no more need personally of additional string and sealing wax. Now certainly, I mean, there is a lot of professions, and I was very much in touch with people doing bioinformatics, where they're simply not manipulating. That's right, they're manipulating on the screen mathematically. And sometimes visually, I guess one connection which people are pushing quite hard on, it's interesting, is the idea of experiencing molecules as objects. I mean, to the extent of having these walk-in rooms where you have films, you know, and show yourself inside the molecule. I'm not sure if that isn't a failure of imagination. I mean, after all, mathematicians spend their whole lives visualizing things without, you know, using this rather clumsy thing. I mean, after all, apart from anything else, you're restricted to 3 dimensions, and you know, it's quite, and also a certain view of matter, which is in the end false. So if you really want to look at something, you probably don't have to do it that way. But coming back to what I thought you were saying, and I would agree very much with, is I think I do view with dismay that schools are junking, actually largely I believe for health and safety reasons, a lot of the hands-on squishy biology that we all do. And I can't see any real justification for this, actually. I don't think there is a health and safety issue, provided, you know, take a few elementary precautions. And that seems a great shame. They should have their fingers into nature.
Well, again, I think there is a counter movement going on, but and more science walks and going out into the countryside and so on. But
my daughter does that. Anyway, we're jumping ahead.
Good. Well, let's go on now to the next school after your preparatory school. Where did you go to school?
So that was Merchant Taylors, the Merchant Taylors company that started its schools way back. This particular one was at Sandy Lodge, Moor Park Sandy Lodge, quite near our home, cyclable now. Again on the Betchman line, Metropolitan line. And I went there because I got a scholarship that paid most of the fees. So that worked out well. Otherwise, I think I would have gone to one of
You were a day boy, were you, if you could cycle?
As a day boy, yes. Most of the boys were. I suppose maybe a fifth or something from the quarter were boarders. I was very glad I was a day boy because my world was a private one where the important things happened in my bedroom at home, which was basically a workshop. And I simply would have loathed being moved. I got terribly homesick when I was removed during that period. Throughout my teenage years, I experienced homesickness acutely. You know, I was sent, for example, on French exchange visits. Travel. So I'm awfully glad I wasn't bored.
Your workshop was the things you were mentioning before, sort of microscopes,
stuff,
and
everything,
all sorts of things.
Physics, chemistry, biology.
I hope you've got some pictures of what it
That
looked like.
I haven't actually.
Photographs.
It's interesting. Where's that? Photography perhaps came later. Maybe I didn't think to photograph my room. Not sure. Interesting.
But what sort of school was it? Was it a good school, and were there any?
Yes, I mean it's if you're going to have a private school, it's one of the better ones. They got a very good record of putting people onto university. They have a connection with Cambridge. Parkin and Stewart scholarship, which I got to Pembroke, I think.
What was it called?
I think it's the Parkin and Stewart. That would need checking. But anyway, there was a linked scholarship. I think it was. I mean, it was not an underhand thing. It wasn't. It wasn't that I wasn't competitive. I think the standards were the same as all with Cambridge scholarships, but it happened this one was endowed in connection with Merchant Taylors. So I got that eventually and came up. But before that, so the experience at school was absolute loathing of competitive sport.
Really?
My heart sinks for the kids like me when I hear the government statements now. Having sold off most of the country's school playing fields, there's now a policy move, I gather, to bring competitive sport back in because then we're going to win the Olympics. And that's all fine for those who want to do it, but the thought of being put on those rugby fields again is just appalling. Not to mention the cricket, which is worse because it goes on so long. So I hated that, and I was bored by history and stuff like that, which was a shame because there were people who did it well, and all I wanted to do was to do science, and I just, as soon as I was able at each level, I shared everything else and just focused on the sciences.
What about music?
Yes, or rather no, I never had any capability for music. The music in my life now comes very much from Daphne, who is she's
your wife. Yeah,
my wife, Daphne, and she's a good pianist and plays the clarinet, and she just always fills the house with music, either played or with people coming round to play with her and so on. And that was lovely. Before that time, well, my parents were certainly, they had rather strong views. I mean, they thought, well, listen to classical music and not to pop. And of course, come to think of it, I mean, I did listen to pop music under the bedclothes. I remember having a crystal session listening to Radio Luxembourg, so of course I'm musical in the sense of appreciating it. But I was never a musician. I never actually mastered an instrument.
Does it, I mean, some people find inspiration in music for their work. You know, they listen to it either when they're working or before, and it takes them into a kind of creativity which spills over into their work. I find this myself with some music. Has that ever happened with you?
No, I really not, I would say. I'm very well aware of the potential, and I find pieces of music very moving, especially live, of course, when you go to a concert there and the experience. But not really as a direct input to work. The thing which directly inputs to work for me, absolutely definitely, is the waking dream. And if I was trying to think through a problem, then often it would come. And now, you know, as I indicated, the bench work is a bit behind me. But what my worry things now, my deadlines, are producing a talk. You know, where I have a vague inkling of what I want to say, but I'm not quite sure how to put it, and I will wake up in the morning and suddenly, you know, some key points are there, and I quickly write them down, and then I find, you know, that's it. Thank heaven, you know, I've got that talk mapped out. So, you know, it's often a new diagram, one new way of expressing something that I want to put across. So that's the moment. But it doesn't have to do with music. It has to do with the process of awakening from some sort of unconsciousness, some place where things are going on which are no longer controlled consciously, and that's really important, and clearly new associations of some kind are made.
Do you keep a pad beside your bed?
I do, absolutely.
The other two kinds of activity which often have the same effect, one is drink.
Ah, yes.
In vino veritas, etc. Does that sometimes...
Yes. It's absolutely true, and it's got its part to play. Not continuously, that would be hopeless. The morning one, of course, is very sober, but absolutely, I love to go for drinks.
You're a pub person?
I am a pub person with others, but also at home in the evening to have a glass or two of wine. Does shake things down in a new way. Often it gives a broader perspective to something I'm working on, and will often suddenly I'll see, you know, that I've got these bits here and they're in the wrong order, and suddenly they'll shake into a better form. So coming to and fro in and out of the drink is very important, and of course I suppose in both cases, the sleep and the drink, there's a removal of the dull insistence of exactness of the conscious mind.
The third...
Actually, one other thing is just wandering around. To me, the other time when things have come to me well, things shake down into place, is walking on a high ridge in Scotland, or Lake District. I love just being up there on my own. I like to wander and be very far from anybody. Those times, then definitely there's something different going on.
Yes, that was the third I was going to mention. I have in my diary, solvita ambulando, it is solved by walking.
Yes.
So many things are solved by walking, almost anything. Most great thinkers I've talked to and read about have found, like Poincaré and so on, have found that it's in the moments of relaxation, walking. I have a thinking path in my home. Darwin had a thinking path.
Ah, yes.
You walk around. I've hardly ever known a problem not be resolved by walking around my garden. Anyway,
Very true.
do you work just on the work thing. I mean, what is your pattern of work? Do you work best in the morning?
Morning.
And are you like mathematicians? In other words, after 3 or 4 hours, you've more or less done what you're going to do that day.
Yeah. If I'm of the hard part, and of course one fills the day with chores. But
In
the
the
hard
morning.
part is in the morning.
And do you take off time that you said you, in your busiest time, you're working at the weekends as well, but do you take a break from time to time, a longer break or a shorter break?
Yes, I mean I love to. I mean one of the frustrations actually in our, it's definitely me together most often, is our present lifestyle, is that my diary is now filled with all manner of engagements, and it's the hardest thing in the world to structure it so as to leave any sort of blocks free. And I was glad that we arranged this conversation way ahead of time, so that both of us are free to do other things on either side, and it becomes absolutely hopeless. But of course, when I'm involved in committees and things like that, and they're always trying to put in extra meetings and beg and plead, it's very hard to make space for these things. So it is hugely important to get out. Of course, one of the things about walking, at least if you do it my way, I'd be curious to know what you do, is that you also disconnect, you're offline. Some people don't go offline. They either take tape recorders with them, or even, of course, they have their Blackberries and so on. And the whole point about walking is you cut all that stuff. And it's just...
I am offline, but I do what Thomas Hobbes the philosopher did, which is to have something in case a thought darts into my mind, which is how he described it. Just a little, what I call a great thoughts book.
Yes,
They're not very great, but I keep it, and then when a thought does come, I jot it down.
Yes. No, I'm absolutely right. I'm not to be found without at least a scrap of paper and a pencil. But also I draw things on there. If I come across things, so you can note down so you forget otherwise.
Lovely. Well, just to finish on school, were there any teachers who you remember who inspired you in any way, or were they all just quite good?
Yes. No, at that stage there were one or two, and they were stronger, brighter people anyway, and so even if I disagreed with them, at least there was something to argue against usually. There was one man in particular, though, that's rather curiously inspirational, called Lloyd.
What was his first name?
I'm just trying to think. I know it. We'd have to look it up. Dear me.
Don't worry.
It's gone. But I've read about him. I've written about him for some piece I was asked to do about my school days, and curiously, I found, comparing notes with somebody else from school. Oh, that's right. We had a sixth formers gathering. It was a funny occasion, but it was fun. And I found that everybody else had the same impression. That he was the one who was inspirational. He was a crazy sort of guy. He's the funniest thing that happened was he started an enormous fire actually when he was demonstrating something in physics, which we all thought was very funny. It was actually rather dangerous. But anyway, the fire was put out, no harm done. But he rushed at things, and I remember sitting, in his class, and so he opened the cosmos to me by showing how through physical and mathematical thought one could in fact reach out far beyond one's own space and time, and that was extraordinary. It's like a great door opening onto the universe. So that's teaching. So there was one person I remember, and that's not to decry the others. I mean, everybody, really pushed me hard and tried to challenge me, and I challenged them at times. I said, well, that's simply wrong. It's tough being a teacher in a school like that. You've got all these smart little Alex coming up.
So they were quite relieved when you got a scholarship and went off to Pembroke. Why did you choose Cambridge?
Oh, it was really just being on the sausage machine at that point. It was just the easiest thing to do. And my parents were quite keen I would go to Oxford or Cambridge, and it happened there was this connection, so I took the interviews. Was accepted.
To read natural science? Or?
Yes, natural sciences. At that time, I was, because of my sort of key interest, I thought physiology would probably be the area. So I took a whole subject physiology actually, and then a whole chemistry and a half biochemistry. That's probably the connection. The physiology turned out it hadn't quite sort of got it in molecular terms. Cambridge physiology went through some sort of revolution about the time I came up, I think. And it was depending who one got taught by and supervised by, whether it was interesting or not. I found it not very interesting because of that. Of course, I should have injected my own interest into it. But on the other hand, I found Ian Fleming in particular, who was my supervisor at that stage in organic chemistry, quite inspirational, because they were very excited about models and theories for, really predictive theories for what electrons were doing in organic molecules as they reacted. So I found this tremendous. I mean, this is, like Meccano's set again. And organic chemistry is like that. I mean, it's a molecular science Meccano. I wondered maybe what Richard Friend's thinking about when he says he would bring back the models. But anyway, so in the end, I decided to do organic chemistry in my third year, and that worked out well actually, because it is a good foundation. You're learning about molecules. There's no point in learning the facts. What you want to do is to learn the mechanisms and ways forward.
Were there any others apart from Fleming who were particularly inspiring as lecturers or teachers?
I just remember in particular.
Or any of your contemporaries who you still remember?
Well, actually, the reason I'm looking a little dull is that I have to confess that I did not enjoy being an undergraduate here at all. I was rather shy and socially distressed, like many another. The lack of girls was a serious issue.
This was 1960 to
I came, 1960 to 63, I was an undergraduate. So things were changing, but just beginning. And for those of us who were less social than average, it was sort of a bit of a monastic life. But more importantly than that was the fact that I just didn't like learning.
Didn't like learning?
Yeah, I backed the fingers, you see. The thing that carried me through all the way was working my fingers. And suddenly, although of course we had practicals, that was all right, you did these and you went in and you came out again, but they're actually quite a small part of it. Most of it was just learning off stuff, and of course trying to be creative about it as well. And I really I felt challenged by it for one thing. I mean, like most most kids who are successful at school, coming to Cambridge is a pretty shocking experience, because you're no longer the big fish in the little pool. You've got all these other big fish that you're bumping up against. So it's tough. It was boring because there was too much book learning and not enough practical. And I was also pretty uncertain, about myself as a person and all the rest of it. So they were lean years for me, with not a lot of comfort, but a few drinking companions. I wasn't a loner totally. I mean, I had a small group of people who'd go and drink beer.
And Pembroke was a reasonable college.
Oh yes, and Pembroke looked after me. It was Dean Dewey, who was my tutor. A very sympathetic man. I didn't understand him at all. I took us to his rooms, and it was all very erudite. Maybe for the first time. He was.
But you must have done well enough in your examinations, because you presumably then went on to...
Well, what happened was, again, rather classical. I mean, the first year I was easy enough, because it was just, being a scholar, I'd already sort of gone ahead of the average bit, so I coast. Second year, one thing was I joined the ADC and took up theatre lighting. Dewey hated this. He said you shouldn't do it. It's always, who's right?
The ADC is the Amateur
Dramatic Club, yes. And I was never on stage, but it was tremendously exciting. I mean, lots of them are coming through. For example, Miriam Margolyes is my contemporary, and so I was doing the electrical, the boffin bit in the back room, and all these bright.
A great period for Cambridge drama.
It's a fantastic period, both the drama, straight drama, and the footlights. It's a wonderful period. And so these people again, I mean, I was in awe of. They were marvellous, and it was tremendous to be sort of touching the hem, of this, and turning the lights on and off. which of course is a very creative thing in itself. It's enormous fun devising lighting, and if you're a technical sort of person, then you find that part of it fun as well. But the important thing is to the creativeness. I mean, theatre lighting is fantastically fun to do. So you paint with these instruments. And so I did that, and of course it means that if you're doing it at all, then you get tremendous pressure because people want you there all night. There's get-ins and get-outs, and the whole theatrical ritual and work is something you fit into the interstices. So I really, I just began to slither down academically in that. I'm not sure how bad it was. Of course, in Cambridge you get away with it for a bit, but I certainly didn't do it at all well in exams at the end of the second year. So I was given a talking to by Dewey and by my parents, and indeed by myself, because after all, I didn't want to be a flop. And the third year, and that was just such a grind. It was awful. I determined that I was going to learn enough to.
So it was a miserable year. It was the same year as my final science. It was very cold, I remember, and it was the Cuban War crisis, and the world seemed to be coming to an end anyway. What was the point?
I wonder how much that, yes, I suspect I was so apolitical that it didn't matter much, quite honestly. I was very detached from that sort of thing. I was very self-centred, I suppose. Anyway, I scraped a 2-1, which was enough for going on in those days.
Was it? It was enough to get a state scholarship?
Oh, no, to become a graduate student?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yes, it's first now, I think, probably.
It is.
There's great inflation, of course.
That's right. I did the same. But had you decided you did want to go on, despite the rather bleak?
No. Because of the whole atmosphere, I decided I was dropping out. In fact, I was all signed up to drop out through VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas. And I would have gone to Africa, and I'm not quite sure what would have happened. Of course, I might well have, squeezed back in again, as people do, but it would be tough. I mean, I had no plans to just take a bit of time off. I decided that, I was fairly useless at what I was doing as an undergraduate, and that the best thing would be for me to just sort of go off and do what I could in the world. And VSO, was a service opportunity which fitted with my own propensities, because I wanted to help people really. I didn't want to go into a business. I wanted to somehow serve, I think. Anyway, by chance, these things are very capricious. The money dried up for the particular scheme I signed up to, and they wrote at the last minute and said, "Totally sorry, it's off." And I was sitting there, nothing to do, so I just wandered along, got an interview with Todd, who had enough space for
You better say a bit more about Todd. He's very famous.
So Alexander Todd was the professor of organic chemistry, and had made his name through the elucidation of nucleotide structures, and had basically set up a school of chemistry there, and it was hugely important behind the discoveries of Crick and Watson in deciphering the structure of DNA. Todd's discoveries were directly important, and I know, as Jim Watson describes in his book, The Double Helix, they personally went along to Alexander Todd to check that their structures were right and it all worked. So he was absolutely part of the chemistry novel, a huge person. But he was running this very good and successful department, which had room for people like me who didn't quite know what they wanted to do, but could be assigned a supervisor, in my case Colin Rees, who became my mentor for the next 3 years, working on the synthesis of oligonucleotides, linking together at the most basic level the individual components of nucleic acid. Dan Brown was his contemporary, and I still have a very good friend who worked for Dan at the same bench. I was working for Colin, he was working for Dan. So Colin looked after me tremendously, and he and the situation changed my life, because suddenly I was put into a situation where I didn't have to do any book learning to speak of. In fact, Colin rather discouraged it. As far as he was concerned, research students' place was at the bench. And
was that what the notice on Crick and Watson's wall, which I've always wondered about? Reading rots the mind.
Reading rots the mind. Well, exactly. I mean, it was that was when he was sharing an office with Sidney Brenner. And of course they both read prodigiously,
Yes, exactly.
but were quite right in saying that in the end you had to do something of your own.
Mm.
But my interpretation of it, although I wasn't aware of the notice at the time, would be more literal. That I simply was not interested in reading, and I was given every opportunity to do everything else. And suddenly I was back in what I'd done as a teenager. My bench was my workshop, and I could explore chemical reactions. And of course, if you do that, you find things. And of course, I was thinking, and we were reading and talking to one another. The group of research students, there were a lot of bright people there, and you could, the discussion group, as it were, was reading.
Is this in the bicycle shed or around?
No, this is in Lensfield Road.
Oh, right.
This is not the origin of the molecular biology lab in Cavendish.
Mm.
This is the big glossy new building that still stands at Lensfield Road.
Oh, right.
It's the chemistry laboratory.
Mm.
So yes, at that point I wasn't a molecular biologist, I was a chemist.
Mm. So you enjoyed it, and you're beginning to enjoy Cambridge as well more at this time.
Well, exactly. I was enjoying Cambridge not in the sense of the university, really. Not in the sense of the colleges, perhaps the point, but in the sense of the science. Exactly. I was doing science again.
After the barren years.
Yes.